sure the pilot washed his hands and sealed his fate.
Until the American
Pleased to meet you. Hope you guess my name.
we will make no progress on dealing with the millions of illegal immigrants who are here now and on rationalizing our system of legal immigration. That's plain and simple and unavoidable. When we use phrases like undocumented workers, we convey a message to the American people that their government is not serious about combating illegal immigration, which the American people overwhelmingly oppose. If you don't think it's illegal, you're not going to say it. I think it is illegal and wrong, and we have to change it. Above all else, the American people want their government to be serious about protecting the public, enforcing the rule of law, and creating a rational system of legal immigration that will proactively fit our needs rather than reactively responding to future waves of illegal immigration. People who enter the United States without our permission are illegal aliens, and illegal aliens should not be treated the same as people who entered the U.S. legally.
Unless you've been living under a rock, you know that the Democratic Party here in America has moved radically to the left. And this didn't happen overnight, and by the way, has little to do with the election of Donald Trump. Trump has just brought the breadth and depth of their lunacy out in the open for everyone to see. And this shift hasn't just been happening in America, but also in Europe. Angela Merkel is leader of the Christian Democratic Union, which is supposed to be Germany's center-right party and had been Germany's most socially conservative and nationalistic mainstream party. But Merkel and her supporters are neither conservative or nationalists. Instead, she has anti-traditional social views, and she's a staunch anti-nationalist. So much so that she wants to dissolve Europe's sovereign nation-states and nationalities, something Marxists have planned for over 100 years. And this swing to the left isn't happening because of the natural evolution of a culture, nor is it happening as some accidental or unintentional consequence. But it's a pre-planned operation engineered by leftists to dismantle Western civilization to its core so they can rebuild it in their image. This isn't hyperbole. They'll gladly tell you that our civilization is an oppressive structure containing capitalistic, imperialistic, racist, sexist, patriarchal systems that produce inequality and which, like I said, they want to replace with their imagined utopia. Now, for the benefit of anyone not all that familiar with cultural Marxism, aka critical theory, let me briefly define how the increasing embrace of far-left ideology in our society was indeed a pre-planned operation. So when Marxism failed to take root in the West, when the predicted workers' revolution didn't happen, a group of Marxist intellectuals in the 1920s created a school of social theory in Frankfurt, Germany, commonly referred to as the Frankfurt School. They believe by focusing solely on economics, Marx missed the huge effect culture has on people. So they took Marxism, divorced it from economics, and married it to culture, and taught how that in a democracy, undermining Western values can be more effective than violent revolution. Then in 1933, Hitler came into power. And because Hitler's agenda included stopping the spread of Marxism to ensure what happened in Russia wouldn't spread to Europe, and because the Frankfurt School Marxists were Jews, they left Germany, took refuge in America, were welcomed at Columbia University, where they fully formed their philosophy, and where they taught how to apply it to society, or rather, how to achieve social domination. Note, postmodernist critiques were developed from critical theory. For example, Kimberly Crenshaw, who developed the theory of intersectionality, was a student at the School for Social Research in New York City, which was the Frankfurt School. One of the architects of this ideology that seeped into nearly every aspect of our society was Max Horkheimer, who wrote, "The revolution won't happen with guns, rather it will happen incrementally, year by year, generation by generation. We will gradually infiltrate their educational institutions and their political offices, transforming them slowly into Marxist entities as we move towards universal egalitarianism. And you know what irks me to no end? What he's saying is, I'm proudly subverting yet another established society that has given me refuge and welcomed me. Also, this shows the Achilles heel of liberal democracies, but that's a topic for another video coming soon. Anyway, when Horkheimer's talking about universal egalitarianism, he's not saying people should have equal rights. He's saying people should have equal outcomes. That socially and economically, people should end up the same because people are innately equal, even morally. And that's a foundational principle of leftist ideology today, and one of the biggest and most detrimental lies being told. Because it tells people, and groups of people, that if they're not the same, if they don't have as much of something as the next guy, even Academy Awards, it's because they've been victimized. It's telling people who aren't oppressed that they are oppressed. This causes bitter indignation at having been treated unfairly, which is the very definition of resentment. And leftism is the ideology of resentment and of victimhood. And the left needs victims, because without the oppressed versus oppressor conflict, leftism is a dead ideology, just another philosophy that has little to no impact on our society. So, leftist ideology is based on the premise that everyone should end up the same, because people are not flawed, only systems and institutions are. Therefore, they conclude that when people don't end up the same, it's because something unjust is happening, namely oppression. More specifically, cultural Marxists believe inequality in society occurs because prejudice-dominant social groups, aka white people, exploit less powerful social groups, which creates a system of privilege and advantage for some, and disadvantage for others. And so they preach the reason there is inequality in society is because whites have unearned privilege derived from oppression. And there you have it, an ideology of resentment towards whites. Now, of course, that's all bullshit, because the reason there's inequality in a merit-based system like ours is because people are innately unequal. We are not the same, and will never be the same. Some people are taller, some are faster, some are better looking, some are smarter, some are dumb as shit. Some people are more creative and end up being an art teacher, some more analytical and pursue engineering. Some are driven, and some are content spending their life sitting on a sofa playing Mario Brothers. Some people are responsible, some irresponsible. Some consistently make good decisions, and for others, life is a never-ending string of bad choices. So naturally, people, and groups of people, and civilizations end up differently. The effects of Islam on a society is not the same as the effects of Christianity on a society. The effects of a relatively free market on a society is not the same as the effects of socialism on a society. And let me be clear about something. When I said we have a merit-based system, I'm not under the illusion that it's perfect. I'd call it a relative meritocracy, because people are inherently flawed, and no, Marxism can't fix that. All Marxism can do is bring the best and brightest in a society down to the lowest common denominator.
The dominant narrative in America is white people are evil, white people suck, we should be ashamed of ourselves, and
I don't think we should be ashamed of ourselves. I think that we should take responsibility for the system that we've created.
the best system in the world?
We do not have the best system in
Who
the
has
world.
a better system?
There are many European countries that are much better off
Oh,
than
you
us.
mean like the European countries with a higher density of whites, like Northern Europe?
That's one way to phrase it, I guess.
You don't mean Turkey.
No.
You don't mean Eastern Europe
No.
with the communists. So the only time you can come up with a system that's better than America, it's a country that's more white than America. I don't understand.
I don't know what to say to that.
So, because cultural Marxists blame white people for the cause of inequality, whites who buy into leftist ideology have to support their own displacement and celebrate everyone but their own people. But then, why do so many whites buy into this ideology? And I had to think about that for a minute because I can't put myself in the shoes of a leftist any more than I can see myself being caught up in some psychopathic Jim Jones religious cult. So I think one reason so many whites buy into leftist ideology is it gives them a sense of identity and purpose, sprinkled with a sense of moral superiority. They see themselves as representatives of the oppressed, fighting to defend them. When people don't know who they are and where they come from and don't have a sense of purpose greater than themselves, which is what we see today more than ever, they leave themselves open to all sorts of doctrines, like leftism. They're like a tree without roots. When the first strong wind comes, it knocks them over. That's why you don't see many people with a deeper sense of their identity, history, and culture buy into cultural Marxism. Another reason so many whites embrace leftism is the natural inclination people have to adhere to a group, the comfort of inclusion. Leftist ideology is touted by Hollywood, pop culture, the mainstream media, and it dominates most universities. And kids don't want to be ostracized by being branded a racist. And by the way, this is an old-school Marxist tactic. The word racist first became part of a society's lexicon in 1930s Russia and was used to browbeat people who weren't wholeheartedly communist. In other words, people who weren't politically correct, a term coined by the Soviets in the 1920s. However, racist had a different meaning then. It meant someone who was nationalistic. Good communists identified with the communist collective, not with their ethnic and cultural heritage. Funny how leftists are using the word racist today the way it was originally used in early communist Russia. Only towards whites, though.
But I'm not a white supremacist. I just want to celebrate my white heritage. Well, I hate to break it to you, but...
Okay, so people love inclusion, and leftists have made it clear that the consequences of dissension are severe. For example, look at Roseanne Barr, who was labeled a racist for supporting Trump, and because she made a racy joke, was fired, costing her tens of millions of dollars minimum. And, to add insult to injury, the cast of her show, the very people who she single-handedly made rich and famous, either kept quiet or proudly and publicly berated her for doing something that she'd been doing all of her life, making racy jokes and being controversial. Another quick example is Taylor Swift, who, as far as I know, is apolitical, at least publicly. And because she refuses to take sides, refuses to talk about politics, and therefore refuses to denounce and bash Trump, she's a racist and white supremacist by default. Welcome to the Noble Revolution. Okay, and one more reason that I can think of why many whites are caught up in this cult is old-fashioned conditioning. This is especially prevalent in leftist-run European countries. People have simply been conditioned through the government, the media, and often their parents that left-wing ideals like multiculturalism and cultural relativism are good, while a notion like Sweden should generally be a country for ethnically Swedish people is evil. However, it's still not all that easy for the left to convince the masses that whites are evil oppressors for creating a civilization that everyone wants to come and live in. So, like we've seen time and time again throughout history, a little revisionist history, aka propaganda, is required to validate their insane bullshit. And this is especially evil because this is how our kids are taught to hate themselves and their culture, which in turn makes them susceptible to leftist ideology.
The Muslims didn't go up from Jerusalem and march up to Europe to attack Christendom. No, the Christians marched down to Jerusalem to attack the Muslims.
I'd be rich if I had a nickel every time a leftist cited the Crusades as an example of evil white European Christians invading the lands of peaceful Muslims and brutalizing them in the name of Christianity. Well, the record of history is clear, and it says, Islam was born in Arabia in the 7th century, and the Mohammedans immediately began attacking the Middle East, which was full of Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, and polytheistic Arabs. Major Christian cities were captured, including Antioch and Jerusalem. Then northern African cities like Alexandria and Egypt were invaded and captured. Then Muslims crossed the Mediterranean and began attacking Europe. They conquered the island of Sicily, and using that as their base, they attacked coastal towns. which entailed killing, robbing, raping, and taking slaves. During this time, over 1 million white Europeans were taken into the Islamic world as slaves. In 846 AD, while attacking Rome, Muslim invaders looted St. Peter's and St. Paul's basilicas, desecrating and pillaging the holiest places in all of Christendom. They also invaded and conquered Spain and tried to invade Europe from the southwest, but were stopped by the Franks at the Battle of Tours, which historians regard as the battle that saved European Western Christian civilization. So all of this so far, about 400 years of brutal aggression, happened before the First Crusade was ever waged. Also, unlike the Mohammedans who waged war because their holy book commanded them to create a worldwide Islamic state, the Pope only got involved to unite the different kingdoms and empires of Europe, which were often at odds with each other, because in unity is strength. So basically, the Pope called on Western European Christians to aid Eastern Christians oppressed by Muslims. So the Crusades were a pushback, and were a result of continual Muslim subjugation. Now, I'm not going to lie, when European kingdoms united and this pushback happened, it was brutal. When the Crusaders, which consisted of about 4,000 mounted knights and 25,000 infantry, when they moved east and began defeating Turkish armies and taking back cities, it wasn't pretty. And when they finally reached Jerusalem and breached the walls, the knights slaughtered everybody inside that wasn't a Christian. Now, I'm not saying what those knights did was right, but after 400 years of brutality against Europe, and after losing 3/4 of their fellow crusaders in bloody battles leading up to Jerusalem, I can understand why they were pissed. So anyway, since this is about context, what's important to know is the Crusades consisted of these battles. Compare that to the 400 or so battles Muslims waged against Europe leading up to the Crusades. Now, unfortunately, the Crusades didn't end Muslim aggression. In 1453, long after the Crusades, they conquered Constantinople, which ended the Eastern Roman Empire. Then they hammered Eastern Europe all the way to the gates of Vienna. So this jihad against the European kafir was relentless and lasted about 1,000 years before white Christians were able to really begin to push them back out and get some of their land back. And on a side note, when a new sultan came to power, it was traditional for him to immediately launch new wars just so he would be known for how well he fought against the infidels. And between the 7th and 15th centuries, Muslims dominated the slave trade, and they dealt in the sale of eunuchs, which were castrated male slaves most often used in military service. Eunuchs were created by amputating the penis and scrotum of 8 to 12-year-old boys, which is why there's no black population in the Arab world today. Well, that and because they would kill the newborn children of their African concubines that they got pregnant. Now, I already mentioned Europeans being enslaved by Muslims as early as the 7th century, but I want to reiterate, while Mohammedans were killing and enslaving Africans, they were doing the same with white Europeans. Before Catherine the Great conquered the Muslim-ruled peninsula of Crimea and put it under Russian rule, millions of Ukrainians, Georgians, Bulgarians, Armenians, and Slavs had been enslaved and sold through Crimea. The term the Crimean raids is familiar to every Ukrainian, Russian, and Pole, as it is an integral part of their history. Also, between 1530 and 1790, it is estimated that North African Muslims abducted and enslaved more than 1 million Europeans from coastal towns and the high seas. They even enslaved Americans.
All right, tell me why I should believe...
However, you're right on your premise.
...that they really want to fight us in Dollywood, but they're not.
Well, let me give you an example from Mr. Jefferson, since you asked me to mention my book, which I happily do, available fine bookstores everywhere. In 1788, when the United States was barely a country,
Right.
Was having its sailors taken as slaves by the Barbary states, the states of the Ottoman Empire in North Africa.
Tripoli.
Tripoli,
The shores of
exactly,
Tripoli.
Shores of Tripoli. And its people, its ships stopped, its crews carried off into slavery. We estimate 1.5 million European and American slaves taken between 1750 and 1815. Jefferson and Adams went to their ambassador in London and said, why do you do this to us? The United States has never had a quarrel with the Muslim world of any kind. We weren't in the Crusades. We weren't in the war in Spain. Why do you do this to our people and our ships? Why do you plunder and enslave our people? And the ambassador said very plainly, Mr. Abdul Rahman said, because the Quran gives us permission to do so, because you are infidels. And that's our answer. And Jefferson said, well, in that case, I will send a navy which will crush your state, which he did, and a good thing,
But
too. Islamic fundamentalism is not created by American democracy. It's a lie to say so. It's a masochistic lie, and it excuses those who are the real criminals, and it blames us for the attacks made upon us. Don't have anything to do.
Now that brings me to the holy grail of the anti-white narrative, slavery. And it's not hard to expose leftists who want to single out whites and blame them for this immoral practice, because just a cursory glance at history shows slavery was common and an accepted way of life in every culture throughout history. It was fully established in every society, and there was a myriad of ways you could become a slave. You could be born a slave, you could lose a war, you could run out of money and be unable to pay your debts, or your parents could just sell you into slavery. But since the left only wants to talk about the Christian slave trade, which was from about 1515 to 1815, let me add this. Slavery in other civilizations was on a larger scale, lasted a longer time, and was more brutal. Also, whites were the first to act on their conscience and abolish slavery, first in Europe, then in America, and through their influence, effectively ended slavery in the world. Although it was practiced in China and various parts of Africa until the 1940s, Saudi Arabia had slavery until 1962, Peru until 1968, and India until 1976. It's probably also worth noting that unlike the Mohammedans, Europeans didn't go into Africa to kidnap and enslave people. They bought slaves from African slave traders who had bought them from African kings and warlords. As a matter of fact, 40% of all blacks in West and Central Africa were slaves within Africa before and during the period of the Atlantic slave trade, which means more than likely Europeans did not cause one single black person to be a slave who already wasn't one. For a little more context, during the period of the Atlantic slave trade, 10% of the enslaved Africans became part of the Atlantic slave trade and were shipped west. About 20% went to the rest of the world, mostly to the Middle East and India, and 70% of African slaves stayed in Africa as slaves. And of the slaves that were part of the Atlantic slave trade, only about 5% came to America. The rest went mainly to Spanish South America and to the Caribbean. And when the Atlantic slave trade ended, the percentage of Africans in West and Central Africa who became slaves didn't decrease. There were just more Africans who stayed slaves in Africa. Also, in America, slavery wasn't just practiced by whites. Indians practiced slavery before any white people ever set foot here, and later they also owned African slaves. Blacks, of course, also owned slaves in America, as they did in Africa. According to the U.S. Census of 1830, in Charleston, South Carolina alone, 407 African Americans owned slaves, and it's estimated that 28% of all freed black slaves owned slaves. The bottom line is demonizing white people because of slavery while giving every other race and ethnic group and civilization a pass is deceptive, agenda-driven leftist conditioning. And it's pathetic that in the age of information there are people dumb enough to buy into the white guilt dribble. And even if white Europeans had been the only people to ever practice slavery, it would still be dumb to collectively blame white people back then for slavery. That's like collectively blaming whites during the Industrial Revolution for harsh working conditions and low wages and child labor. Most whites back then were poor and weren't exactly pro-low wages and shitty working conditions, just like most weren't pro-slavery. And not just because of moral reasons, but because slavery drove down wages, among other things.
Anti-whites have become so bold, so arrogant that they're taking it way too far too fast. I should just kick back and watch the show because they're waking a sleeping giant, one that will not be conquered, a giant that will put an end to all this nonsense. There's an even bigger demographic of white males you haven't even heard from yet. The left lives in constant fear and paranoia of this reality. The men who quietly watch from afar, who work and mind their own business, but they see everything.
I've said this before, and I'll say it again. The purveyors of cultural Marxism aren't imbeciles. They're smart people. But like the Mensa member who thinks he can commit the perfect murder but makes a dumb mistake that gets him caught, there's something neo-Marxists didn't account for. Something that frustrates them to no end. And that's the power of cultural pride. Cultural pride is why Austrians removed the Social Democrats from power last October and replaced them with right-wing parties that promise to keep Austria's culture and traditions intact. Cultural pride is why parties that were undermining Italy's culture, even though they'd been in power since the end of World War II, were crushed in the Italian elections last March. Cultural pride is why a French party that couldn't even get enough votes to be represented in Parliament a couple of years ago is now Germany's second largest and most powerful party, and growing. Cultural pride is why the party that stands for Swedish nationalism recently became the most popular party in Sweden. And in order to strip people of cultural pride, you have to strip them of their national or ethnic identity. And people who aren't brainwashed are going to naturally resist that. And I say naturally because it's biologically ingrained in us. Human nature is tribal. We naturally care about our own family more than someone else's family. We care more about our own nation more than a foreign nation. And by nation, I mean a people with a shared heritage, which includes a common language, history, religion, and ancestry. It's no coincidence, nor is it because of racism, that 85% of American churchgoers go to churches that are composed of entirely or almost entirely one race. Now, like I said, leftists don't really understand having pride in your culture, your people, and your homeland. And we know this because they're leftists, but more specifically, because they smugly say stuff like, why would you be proud of something you had no hand in doing, of something you didn't accomplish yourself? Why would you even be attached to it? And when they say something like that, it tells you all you need to know about them. Look, I'm not trying to take credit for someone else's accomplishments. It's not about that. It's about the kind of pride that you might feel for your father or children. It's natural to take pride not only in your own achievements, but in the people and things that are connected to you. And so it's natural to take pride in something that was gifted to you. And my cultural heritage is a gift. No, I didn't earn that gift. Nevertheless, it is mine. Remember this flick? Should Tao have refused Walt's gift of the 1972 Gran Torino because he didn't build it himself or buy it himself? Is he not allowed to take pleasure and feel pride in owning it? And as Tao couldn't thank Walt for the Gran Torino, we can't personally thank our ancestors for what they created and for the blood they shed to pass their culture on to us intact. It's not by accident Vienna doesn't resemble Mogadishu. And for that, we should be thankful. And we should treasure and appreciate the things gifted to us. And we can show our appreciation by passing our culture on to future generations intact. As I said earlier, leftism is the ideology of resentment, one of the worst emotions someone can have. Show me a leftist and I'll show you someone who's not grateful for anything. Of course they don't understand cultural and national pride because those things are the manifestation of being grateful and thankful and appreciative. And when the left says we don't have any right to take pride in the things our ancestors did because we didn't personally do them, they're again speaking out of both sides of their mouth. Because in the next breath they'll say, but you should feel guilt and shame for the things you didn't personally do, but your ancestors did. And does the left ever criticize non-whites for showing ethnic and cultural pride? No, they encourage it. Proclaim your brown pride, and the left thinks that's great. But say it's okay to be white, and they lose their collective mind. There's no controversy in saying black is beautiful, but if a white woman says white is beautiful, she's branded a hateful, evil person. When non-whites want to remain homogenous, it's cultural pride. But whites against mass third world immigration into their countries are Nazis. In conclusion, because it's healthy, everyone should be proud of their cultural heritage and ethnic identity. And that includes white people. You know, we came from philosophers, explorers, conquerors, pioneers, inventors, and builders of the greatest civilization the world has ever known. A civilization that's made this world an immensely better place for everyone. We can be proud of that, and know, in being proud, you're being grateful.